네, 안녕하세요. 연합인포맥스의 서영태 기자입니다. 오늘은 세계은행의 제이슨 알포드 한국사무소장님 모시고 인터뷰를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Alford. Yeah. My first question is, what is World Bank? And I want to know about the Korea office and what is your job at there?
Okay. Well, the World Bank started we were set up after World War II, and initially what we were was an international institution aimed at post-war reconstruction. So we would finance countries to rebuild after World War II. But once that was complete, what we found was that there was still a need for financing for development. So the World Bank switched to an institution that financed countries to develop in a way that would reduce poverty. So we're an institution that's focused on poverty reduction now. And we do that in various ways. We have an arm called the IBRD and also IDA, which works with sovereign governments, providing them with financing. We also have IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which work with the private sector on development tasks. So the organisation has shifted a little bit. In most of the countries where we work, what our country offices do, of course, is work with developing countries on programs for their development, and we assist them with both developing the programs and the financing. But in Korea, we don't do that because Korea doesn't need our financing, of course. It's a high-income country. So what we do in Korea, we set up our office here about 10 years ago. And we work with Korean partners to learn about Korea's development experience, and we take those, the things that we learn from Korea to other countries in the Asian region, to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Philippines, but also further sometimes to South Asia and to Africa. My role, so I'm the head of our office here. In fact, as we discussed previously, I'm a macroeconomist, but in our office we do have some economists, but we have engineers, we have IT experts, we have lawyers, so a very diverse team that work with different parts of the Korean government. As I said, learning about Korea's development experience and taking that to other countries.
Yes. Now Korea, as you said, there's no need to reduce poverty in Korea, but Korea was a very one of the poorest countries in the world, and World Bank played important role reducing Koreans' poverty. So how do you evaluate Korea's economic development in the past 60 years?
Well, Korea had a very impressive development trajectory. As you said, after the war on the Korean Peninsula, there was very little left in Korea. A lot of the infrastructure had been destroyed. Many people had been killed. A population of a little over 20 million was the main resource that was left in what became the Republic of Korea. And from that, you know, a very poor population of a little over 20 million people, Korea has become the 10th largest economy in the world, so an extraordinary development path. What Korea did at the beginning, it invested in its people. It invested in education, both for children. It very quickly got to very close to 100% enrollment rates in elementary schools, but it also invested in adults, in literacy programs for adults, and turned around that education of the population. The other thing Korea did was invest in infrastructure, in basic public infrastructure, and of course the private sector in Korea began to develop and invest in manufacturing facilities. And what Korea did was transition that path up the value chain. So initially it was very simple manufactures that Korea focused on, clothing and textiles, that type of thing. But very quickly, within 10, 20 years, Korea was switching to more sophisticated manufactures, eventually, of course, a very big automobile industry, for example. And then the next wave was a switch to high-tech industries, consumer electronics, that sort of thing. So, of course, we all know Korean companies for their consumer electronic goods that are sold around the world, but also the inputs into that. So the semiconductor industry, of course, is very huge. So Korea focused on moving up that value chain, producing an export-oriented economy. It was a very impressive performance. The World Bank was with Korea. We partnered through all of that. So initially what the World Bank did, as I told you, the World Bank in most countries finances development. So when Korea was lower income, we would provide financing to government. Initially in the early 1960s, that was for railways, it was for roads, it was for schools. And I find that quite amusing because, I mean, the Korean railway system now, you know, it does not need foreign financing from an organisation like the World Bank. As Korea's manufacturing became more sophisticated, so did the kinds of help that Korea requested from the World Bank. So we switched to working on things like skills development, research and development, industrial policy, so those types of more sophisticated things. And of course, eventually, as we know, Korea became high income. It didn't need that kind of partnership with the World Bank anymore. So we switched to this knowledge partnership where now the World Bank is learning from Korea's development experience. So that partnership has continued from the early 1960s till today, and we're now getting to take advantage of Korea's extraordinary development experience to help other countries.
Thank you for explaining the development we had achieved. And I wonder what have been key drivers for the Korean economic development, and what should be key drivers for future sustainable development?
As you know, I was at a conference the other week and I made the joke that Korea's secret to success is that Koreans are very hardworking. And what else do we need to know? But of course, the reality is more complicated. It is true that Koreans are very hardworking, but the story is bigger than that. And I think the things that Korea focused on initially, it was those macroeconomic frameworks, so good monetary policy, good fiscal policy, sound governance. It focused on investments in the things that produce economic growth. So investments in education, investments in its people, investments in the physical infrastructure, in roads and railways and those things that lead to productivity. And it, as we said, moved up the value chain and in some ways a very traditional growth path. Towards the end, focus on technology, boosting productivity, moving into high-tech industries. So that's the literal path that Korea followed. But why did Korea follow that path when other countries haven't been as successful as Korea? And that's a more difficult question. Since moving to Korea 2 years ago, I've heard a lot of people refer to the miracle on the Han. And of course, if you look at pictures of Seoul in 1950s and 1960s, and you look at Seoul today, it is like a miracle. It's an extraordinary transformation in 60 or 70 years. But I think miracle makes it sound like it's somehow magical, and I don't think the transformation is magical. I think what the key to Korea's success is the willingness of Korean governments and businesses and people to make decisions, to try things that will lead to development, and to review the impacts of their decisions. And where they think those were the wrong decisions, they go back and make a different decision and try again. And I think just that process of simple, practical policy making in government, simple, practical decision making in businesses, willingness of the population to become educated and to aspire to achieve. And I think that is probably more the secret of Korea's success. Future challenges, of course, will be very different from what we've seen in the past, and will also be difficult. So things like facing climate change, facing the trade tensions that we see in the world today, facing some of those economic challenges, aging population. That's a different set of challenges, but I think that foundational issue is still there, that factor that led to Korea's success. So the willingness to make decisions, to review the impact of the decisions you've made, and be willing to change if what you're doing is not working. For the World Bank, that's a very powerful message that we take from Korea to other countries. This consistency of policy making, willingness to review, willingness to try things, willingness to change. It's a very powerful combination.
I want to ask you about Korean companies. How can they participate in other countries' development plan? And they have rich experiences, and they have expertise in tech and climate sectors like that. So how can they participate in other countries' development?
Yeah. So you're right that Korean companies have a lot of expertise in exactly the things that the world needs to know about now. So digital, climate change, very topical issues for the world. And Korean companies know a lot about that, and other countries around the world want to know more about that. My first answer to your question is a very simple answer, and that is that Korean companies should keep doing what they've always done, and that is to go out and look for profits and look for ways to make money. Because in that process of finding ways to make money, what they will do is they will invest in the places that are good to invest, and some of them will invest in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and Philippines. They will build manufacturing facilities there, they will build technical facilities. And what they will do is employ people, local people from the host country, and they will pay taxes in the host country. So through that process, they will support development. They will build up the best place to learn skills, I think we all know, is on the job, when someone's teaching you what to do. and a Korean company operating in another country will pass on skills. There will be skills development in the local population that will be important for development. The tax revenue that they pay into those countries, that can be used for things like provision of public services that may be underdeveloped in poorer countries. So I think that's the first answer. For the companies that want to become more sophisticated than that, I guess what I would like to see them do on their own, or with help from organisations like mine, like the World Bank, is to think more clearly about that process of transfer of knowledge, building up of skills, and to think about how they can support the local employees, the local population, not just to build up their skills in one position, but aspire to move into more senior positions, aspire to move into management positions, aspire to become educated and move into professional positions. So for the companies that want to support that, I think that's a good thing to do. For knowledge transfer, again, some companies these days will do this on their own they will have research arms or philanthropic arms where they will work with developing countries to transfer knowledge and work on development issues. And again, they can work with organisations like ours. So we are very interested in understanding the way that Korean companies make decisions, the way that they develop, and taking that knowledge to other countries. We can do that in general through some of our other operations, or we can do it quite specifically. For example, in a country like Vietnam, Korean companies are working with us to actually build technology parks, to build places where local population will develop its skills, become stronger performing employees, and use that knowledge when they move on to other jobs and other parts of the economy.
Okay, so you're a macroeconomist, so I have to ask you this question. According to the World Bank, the global economy is expected to grow 2.1% this year, and that's a higher number than the previous forecast. So can I be more optimistic when I see Korea's economy? What do you expect in the second half of this year and next year?
I thought you were going to ask me if the Bank of Korea is going to put interest rates up or down next. I wouldn't be able to answer that. So this question is an easier one at least. So you're right that our forecast for growth in 2023 is 2.1% for the global economy, and that's a little bit higher than last time we produced a forecast for 2023. But I think an important point here is that is still quite low. In fact, in 2022, growth was, I think, around 3.1%. Some of that, of course, was recovery from weakness during the pandemic. But 2.1% is down on what we had in 2022, and it's a fairly weak number for the global economy. And why is that? And the world is still facing a lot of intersecting challenges. So we have COVID, even though we feel like that's behind us, the economic effects of that are still lingering. We have the war in Ukraine, of course, which is having direct impacts in parts of Europe and also affecting trade around the world. And we have high inflation, which interest rates, central banks are having to fight that in a lot of countries with tight monetary policy that's putting pressure on economic growth. So I think there's a range of challenges there for the global economy that are quite difficult. Some of those we will pass through, and we expect in 2024 that growth will be a little stronger. So COVID will gradually recede. We hope that central banks become successful in their fight against inflation, and they can start to loosen monetary policy at some point in the next couple of years. But it is still a very difficult time for the global economy. For a country like Korea, an export-dependent economy, relies on a healthy global economy for Korea to be successful. That's a very challenging environment in which to operate. So I think as the global economy recovers, that will help Korea. That will provide more markets for Korean goods, but very challenging. I think an additional challenge for Korea that's maybe even more acute than some other export-oriented economies is the types of goods that Korea exports. So semiconductors in particular, as you would know, the global trade tensions, a lot of that is around high-tech goods. And for Korea, that means possibly reorienting the markets where those goods go to, finding new markets. And it's not even just with the final consumer, it's also the value chain for that production. So in some cases, the production is actually done in other countries that might be affected by some of the trade difficulties we're seeing. or the sourcing of the raw materials that goes into the production of semiconductors can also be difficult. So some particular challenges for Korea around that. I think if I can finish on a positive note, we know that Korean companies are working hard to diversify both where they source inputs from, where they do their production, and where their final customers are. So that process of diversification will help them to manage the risk now and in the future that trade tensions affect particular markets. And I think that's a very sensible thing to be doing. From World Bank side, it's also positive because it's often good for development because they will start to switch to countries that need the investment to create those opportunities for domestic production, for domestic employment that I think are very important for poverty reduction.
Thank you. So the next question is about the long-term growth. You mentioned about the challenges Korea is facing this year and next year, but still Korea has a strong economic fundamentals. However, the demographic challenges, aging population, the challenges weigh on long-term growth and sustainable development of Korea. So what should we do to navigate through those challenges?
You're right. So aging is a challenge for the whole world. Birth rates are falling around the world and all countries will be affected. But Korea is one of the ones that's at the forefront of this difficulty, if I can put it that way. Japan also. So Korea and Japan both at the edge of the aging population. And that does create a challenge that, in theory, for Korea, what that's leading to is a population that's steady or even falling. So the tendency will be for GDP, which is linked to population very closely, that will put downward pressure on GDP growth, will make it lower than it otherwise would have been. In principle, it should be possible to have a smaller population and still be just as wealthy. It's GDP per capita that matters for that. So your population gets smaller, and your GDP gets smaller, but if both get smaller at the same rate, then people individually are just as wealthy. But that isn't the whole story. That isn't exactly how it works, because in this transition point as the population ages, what you get is an increasing number of older people relative to the size of the working population. So the population that actually produces most of the GDP and pays most of the taxes is smaller relative to the size of the overall population. The same thing can happen, in fact, when you have a population boom. If you have more young children, you can actually get a smaller working age population relative to the size of the overall population. So your question, what can Korea do about this? It is a very difficult question to tackle because population is a difficult thing to influence. I mean, you can take measures to try to boost birth rate, but that's very difficult to find what are the right measures to use. And even if you're successful, it will be many years before that has an impact on the demographic makeup. The other thing you can do is try to change that population mix by opening up your economy to immigration or allowing foreigners to work for extended periods. And in fact, Korea has taken steps in that direction to loosen some of the length of stay provisions that foreign workers are allowed to remain in Korea for. So you can tackle it that way. And the other way you can tackle it is your traditional economic growth policies, so pro-growth policies. So if you don't have population growth, in Korea, of course, the economy is very advanced, so you can invest in physical capital. That helps, but it's not going to be a dramatic source of growth. So the thing you need to look for in a country like Korea is what are the policies that will actually boost the productivity of our economy, make us more efficient at producing the things that we produce. And again, that's a very difficult policy area because often it's politically very difficult to implement those types of policies. So it's things like pro-competition reforms or opening up your markets or those traditional economic recommendations. So in Korea, Korea has been looking at all of those solutions and implementing some of them, and I think that's the best path to go down.
Yes. Before you leave, do you have any messages for the public or for financial institutions and companies?
Sure. So I think for the public, I think for me, working in an international institution, I would say Korea has always been an internationally focused country, and it has grown through exports, which by its nature is an international focus. and I would say support that, be strong supporters of Korea's international engagement and support that continuing. For Korean businesses, what I would say is we talked about them investing in other parts of the world, and I think that's an important thing for them to do, and to keep doing that. But also to look for opportunities that they can engage with risk, go into places where they might not ordinarily invest, and think about can we manage the risks in this environment, but to get the benefits of investing in new countries, to be at the frontier of investment. And I think now that many Korean companies have a lot of capital that they can take overseas, increasingly they can look for those opportunities. For an organisation like the World Bank, again, that's very helpful because it's going to be through the private sector that fundamental growth happens in developing countries. And they should look to organisations like ours to help them if they go into places where the risks are difficult to manage. Talk to the World Bank, talk to the International Financial Corporation, talk to the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Those types of organisations can help you assess those risks and maybe come up with the financial tools that allow you to manage them best.
오늘은 세계은행의 제니슨 알포드 한국사무소장님 모시고 한국 경제 발전과 한국 경제에 대해서 이야기 나눠봤습니다. 앞으로 더 좋은 인터뷰로 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다.